Good. Right, good morning, everyone.
Martin, you're muted. You need to unmute.
Right. Right. Is that better? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me, Mother? Can you hear me, Mother?
Yeah, no problem.
Right. Right. Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
Lovely to see you all. Let's keep our fingers crossed that this works well this morning. As I said in several occasions, I am struggling a little bit with the technology because I want to get have the video showing Judy speaking in when we get going. I have loaded the first video up onto YouTube, and if it works again today, I will circulate to everyone the recipe for having a look at it. It is quite interesting in that it shows us what we're doing, and it's quite fun, really. We will be doing another one in a fortnight. I hope everybody's got the notes, and let's invite Judy to come across and we'll make a start. Right. Why can't I get me in big?
Top right, go into view and go into rather than gallery view, go into speaker view.
Right, speaker view in. Good. I shall change seats with Judy now and hand over to her. You're going to speak up.
Yeah.
This meeting is being recorded.
Sit in the coffee.
There she is.
Right, there we go.
Martin, we've lost Judy's picture. We've just got a M on that screen.
Right, off.
Morning, everybody.
Morning.
Good morning. Yes. Lovely to speak to you.
Morning. Morning.
Can you feedback? Is that all right? Feedback.
Martin, have you got two devices working?
Try that.
Is that better?
No, we're still getting feedback.
You need me to say something? Still getting feedback. You want me to move?
No.
Now you've muted yourself, Martin. That's better.
Try that.
Hello again.
That's it. That's it. Well done.
Right. Just to explain explain why we're doing this, and it doesn't appear to be in sequence. It actually is in sequence. It's a very important topic, as we all know. It's very current, and it is actually chronological, because the abolition of the slave trade was a great issue during the reign of George III. The campaign was during his reign, and that's what we're going to do. And then there's a second program, you could say. The second issue will be the campaign to end slavery itself. So this morning it is about the slave trade. And then the next one in a fortnight will be the much harder struggle, actually, to end slavery itself, which didn't happen until 1833, which is the reign of William IV. Beg pardon. Some people have said that we invented the slave trade. We didn't. The Portuguese and the Spanish were trading in black slaves, taking people from Africa, long before we did. But what we did, we made it a commercial success. And the first occasion when somebody from our country traded in slaves was 1562, when Sir John Hawkins actually took some slaves from Sierra Leone, 300, and took them across the Atlantic and sold them in what is now Haiti, it's called Hispaniola then, and obviously made a lot of money. It's quite embarrassing to think that Queen Elizabeth I, was very involved in this, because she was very concerned about the national finances. She knew what it was like to be not poor exactly, but to be short of money. And she was like her grandfather, very concerned and very interested in money. She checked the accounts just as her grandfather, Henry VII, had done. And so she recognised that she was onto a good thing, investing money in this trade, which is somewhat embarrassing now. We would like to say that we were the country that ended the slave trade, and we were the country that sort of released our slaves before other countries did. And so we like to think again that we're on the moral high ground, but the facts are not in favour of that view. We developed what was called the Atlantic Triangle, or the triangular trade, which we will come to, where you couldn't lose money, you could only make money. An absolutely wonderful commercial enterprise, which again is embarrassing. Why did they choose black Africans? Because slavery, as you know, was known in the ancient world. The Roman Empire was built on slavery. Why were black Africans chosen? Well, when the Spanish and later the French discovered the Caribbean islands, they discovered the Caribbean Indians, or Caribs they were called. And they decided to try and make them do the work on what later became plantations and grow sugar, in that case, on the Caribbean islands. And they discovered that the Carib Indians didn't like that kind of work. They weren't used to it. And they refused. Even when they were rounded up and punished, they still refused. It was not their culture. Some of them were actually hunter-gatherers. They weren't used to growing crops, and they refused to submit to these white Europeans bossing them around and telling them what to do. They also suffered, I mean, we all know this, that they suffered very badly from imported illnesses. They had no immunity whatsoever, and they died in vast numbers from measles and particularly smallpox. So this sounds very hard-hearted and cold-blooded, but basically they were an unreliable workforce. So The question was, where were they going to get a reliable workforce that would work long hours in the heat and produce a valuable, saleable crop? And the answer was Africans. They were available in large numbers. We were already trading with Africa. European countries were trading down the west coast of Africa. And it's also true, and this is used as an excuse, and although we all know about it, that the African chiefs were very willing to get rid of their prisoners of war and their prisoners, rather than have to spend money feeding them and looking after them. Totally cold-blooded. If you took prisoners, you killed them. Or, in this case, you could profit by selling them. Now, this is used, of course, or was used in the past as an excuse for not releasing, for not ending the slave trade. Yeah, and the argument used today, well, the Africans themselves were complicit, which is true. Absolutely true. The middlemen were Arabs who had known about Africa for longer than Europeans and had been trading for longer and had connections. The beauty of using that, well, the advantage of using the Africans again was that they were easy to enslave. They lived in little villages. They weren't, they were very easy to attack. And the Africans themselves had primitive weapons. They couldn't defend themselves. So they were easy to take, easy to kidnap. So what happened was that after this initial foray into slave trading, it grew very, very quickly because it was so incredibly commercially profitable. And again, that is very embarrassing to say nowadays, but we have to face up to it. That's why it lasted for so long. And now, of course, people are being outed. Great families are being outed as having connection with the slave trade, which is very embarrassing for those families. Some of them didn't realise, and some of them knew, and it kind of hushed up. And obviously it started with destroying the statue in Bristol. But now, of course, it's spreading, and more great families with great stately homes are discovering to their horror that a lot of the finances for the great estate and the wonderful house, the stately home, was based on slavery, on slave trade, and owning a plantation, of course. And that is very, very embarrassing for a lot of people, because many actually didn't know that their money came from a disreputable source. You've got a picture in your notes of the triangular trade, which we'll come to shortly. There was disquiet from groups of people. Despite it being such a success, there were people who were very disturbed about this idea of capturing people and forcing them to work for nothing and being taken across the sea in disgusting conditions. Most people closed their eyes to it, of course, and thought, well, as long as we're making money, we don't want to know too much about how the money's being made. We're really not interested, or we prefer not to know. We just like the idea that we've got shares and the money's rolling in. The famous picture which you've got on your notes of the slave ship, a sort of cross section, I've disappeared.
There's somebody on called Brian Pepper who shared his screen. He needs to unshare rather urgently. I can't take him off. Brian Pepper, you need to unshare your screen, Brian. Thank you. Okay, we should be up and running again, Martin.
Hello, I'm back. Just saying about the diagram of the slave ship. It was actually a wooden demonstration model which the campaigners took to meetings to shock people into realizing what the slave trade actually involved for the Black Africans. And it was amazingly effective. There were then prints, which is what you see here. They hadn't got photocopying facilities in those days, but prints and copies were made, which could be then distributed to people to show them the appalling conditions in which the Black Africans were conveyed across the Atlantic. The Middle Passage, it was called. The Middle Passage, which really became a byword for horror. The slaves were shackled to each other and onto the deck. So there's no chance of escaping. They were allowed onto the deck. They were unshackled, sometimes twice a day, sometimes only once, for food and for, they were told to dance. That was their exercise. They were forced to dance. You imagine they didn't feel like dancing, but some of them actually took that opportunity to throw themselves overboard. They were in such despair. They didn't know what was awaiting them, but the voyage was so dreadful. They were seasick, and of course they had to be sick where they lay. Toilet facilities were incredibly primitive, so they did what they had to do where they lay. But the saying was you could smell a slave ship 10 miles away. That was probably an exaggeration, but the whole process was really disgusting. They were animals. They were treated, in fact, somebody can say they were treated worse than animals because there were always more where they came from. So a third of them often died on the voyage, and the bodies were just thrown overboard. There is a belief, I don't know how valid it is, that's why Black people are not fond of swimming. There are all sorts of theories as to why the Black people don't compete in Olympic sports, in any water activities. And it's quite a convincing argument that they associate water with slavery and cruelty and despair. So the slaves were but before that, they were, there are pictures again that Martin's found, and I must say here, tribute to Martin, he was brilliant at finding appropriate pictures, some of which I was familiar with from textbooks we had at school. Others were new, so many thanks to Martin for finding these pictures and producing them. Over the years, 12 million Africans were forced from their homes and sold as slaves, thousands of miles from Africa. It is a horrifying number. One of the very interesting challenges that we had in the history department in Alpha Terry, it was actually in the textbook, so we didn't make it up, was for top sets, because lower sets probably couldn't have dealt with it, but for top sets too, it was a challenge. Which do you think was the greatest crime against humanity? The Holocaust or black slavery? Which led to some very interesting arguments and debates and ideas. And we never really reached a conclusion, but that the idea wasn't really to reach a conclusion, it was to think about these issues. So a lot of people were aware of the cruelty, but the commercial success of this system was so enormous that some people just calmed their consciences down by just thinking of the amount of money it was making, and preferred not to think about the way in which the slaves were carried from Africa across the Atlantic. The whole idea of the triangular trade was that you never travelled with an empty ship, which is a good commercial system anyway, if you can manage it. Never travel with an empty hold. So the ships left Liverpool and Bristol, the two main ports that were involved in the slave trade, left with cargo to take to Africa. So red cloth was very popular with African kings and chiefs. Mirrors, they found them fascinating because they couldn't make mirrors, so they found mirrors and glass very fascinating. Shiny things, so a lot of brass from Birmingham was used, excuse me, because it looked like gold. And all sorts of manufactured goods taken to Africa and sold, so you're making a profit straight away. Then, with the help of the Arab middlemen, Negro people, black people were kidnapped from their villages or taken from some kind of holding area where the chieftains had kept their prisoners of war or their prisoners, their convicts. And these slaves were sort of stacked in a kind of warehouse, kind of called a factory. A lot of them are still available for visitors to see, for tourists. Large stone buildings where the slaves were kept until there were sufficient in number to fit them onto a slave ship. So they had to wait, sometimes for months in horrible conditions, usually in the dark. There were sometimes no windows, so they were kept in. And again, many of them died. Many of them died before they'd even got onto a slave ship. But eventually, they were stacked onto the slave ship, and they were then taken across to the Caribbean islands or Central America or America itself, the southern states where they were growing cotton in plantations. So they were growing cotton or tobacco, like Virginia, or sugar, of course, in the Caribbean islands. The weather and the soil were absolutely ideal for growing sugar, producing sugar cane. Then the ship was cleansed, and then the slave trader, having sold his slaves and made a great deal of money, filled the hold with the goods that were available, like molasses and sugar, and brought full cargo back to, in this case, Britain, to Bristol or Liverpool, and then sold those goods. So it was win-win, selling and selling. And of course, the slaves sold for a high price, but hadn't cost anything. So a complete profit. So incredibly successful from the commercial point of view, which is very, very embarrassing. People don't like to talk about that, which is why really I think we should be doing this as a study. we really need to address this and face up to it. Not feeling guilty because we weren't there at the time, but just to understand the culture, which was totally different then. That the commercial side of things was preeminent. The fact that the slave traders could then pay higher taxes, it helped the British economy. That was a powerful argument, paying taxes. It was seen as a very good system. And some people that are attacking it now just don't understand how historically it was seen as a very good thing. There were people who were against it from the start, who believed it was evil and wicked and against the laws of God. But interestingly, there were many very good Christian people who were totally in favour of it. Totally in favour of it. The campaign, of course, we know that this is, again, so typical of history, that you get one person who gets all the credit, William Wilberforce, and other people, others airbrushed out of history, they hardly get a mention. It's all William Wilberforce, and most people have heard of him, and they do know that he was a dedicated campaigner and spent his life, his adult life, campaigning first against the slave trade and then against slavery itself, and succeeded virtually on his deathbed. He died a few days after the 1833 Act was passed through Parliament that we would no longer hold slaves in the Caribbean. So he dedicated his life, but he didn't only dedicate his life to slavery. He had many other interests, which we will do next time. We'll do William Wilberforce in detail. The real stars, they started the movement in 1787, so in the reign of George III. Thomas Clarkson and Granville Sharp formed the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Clarkson was an Anglican clergyman, and somebody described him, and I think this is lovely, as a moral steam engine. A lovely phrase. And what a lovely compliment. A moral steam engine. And the movement did gain many supporters, partly because of the persistence and determination of the campaigners, and also because some people, right from the start, had a sensitive conscience about the idea of seeing some people as inferior and therefore available for exploitation, when the New Testament certainly is, we are all equal in the sight of God, we are all sinners, and exploitation of one group of people by another group is morally and ethically wrong. And I'm delighted to say that the Methodists were of that opinion from the get-go. They were opposed to slavery. They were opposed to the idea of going to Africa and collecting people and exploiting their innocence. And it's good to know that there were people who were against the idea from the start. And the numbers increased because of the campaign. The campaign was very, very successful in many ways. But they were fighting against the idea of profit. They were fighting against the fact that it was such a commercially successful venture and people were making fortunes. So that made the whole thing hard work, to put it mildly. Hard work. The main problem was that however many of the public they could convert to believing that the slave trade was fundamentally evil and against the will of God, However many of the public, our ancestors, they could convert and persuade, the fact remained that they had to persuade the House of Commons. It had to be done by Act of Parliament. It had to be made illegal to trade in Africans. And the campaigners just met a total barrier of resistance when it came to persuading the House of Commons. Wilberforce, of course, the reason he gets so much publicity was that he was an MP. He was an MP for Hull and then for Yorkshire. And that's where that's how he became famous, by standing up in the House of Commons. And somebody said, whatever they were debating, whatever they were talking about Wilberforce, if you caught the speaker's eye, brought the subject back to the slave trade. He was very, very determined and very clever and resourceful, and he would bring up the issue of the slave trade. It was what he wanted above everything. It was his life's work. It was his mission to persuade the House of Commons to change their minds about the slave trade. But he met this barrier of resistance. I'm going to do part of what is really part of the next session, but just to use the arguments, just to go through the arguments that were used in favour of the slave trade and later in favour of slavery itself, even after the slave trade had been abolished. The idea of holding slaves continued until 1833, the second part of Wilberforce's life mission. And the arguments were actually very convincing, as long as your mind is open to be convinced. So the arguments were, first of all, the Africans were better off on the plantation than they were in Africa. That the African chiefs exploited their own people, a great deal of cruelty, that was true. That their standard of living was higher, because after all, it was said, if they're working on a plantation, they're given a nice place to live, accommodation, free food, free clothing. The work isn't so arduous. It's not as difficult as growing their own food, which they would have done in Africa, subsistence living. That they were doing, looking after sugar cane, for example. We're talking about slaves on Jamaica and the Caribbean islands. It would have argued it wasn't arduous, wasn't difficult, and there were lots of them doing the work. Not as difficult as being in Africa and worrying about where their next meal was coming from if there was a drought or locusts or difficulties of that kind. They didn't need to worry. They were being fed. They were being fed well, so that they'd have the strength to do the work. Another argument, back to the African chieftains, was willing to sell their prisoners and their prisoners of war. So, if the Africans themselves were complicit, how could it be wrong? Another argument was that we were exposing them to Christianity, and before that they'd been superstitious heathens, so that was win-win, teaching them about. So how could that be wrong then? God would be very happy about that. We were teaching them about Christianity. Arguments about the fact that they were cared for, and that if they were ill, that somebody tried to help them and make them better. Whereas in Africa, it was so primitive, they were just being allowed to die. So they were better off. But the most powerful argument was called the myth of the happy slave, and that was people being invited to go to plantations and witness for themselves. If they were so concerned, open invitation. Well, come and have a look for yourself. Come and see our slaves. They're not unhappy, far from it. After work, they sing and they dance. Now, would they do that if they were miserable? The myth of the happy slave, very powerful. Because yes, they were singing and they were dancing. Another argument, similar argument, why don't you ask them? You know, why don't you actually come over to the Caribbean island? Why don't you interview them? Why don't you ask them? If you're so concerned about them, why don't you get it from the horse's mouth? Why don't you ask them if they're happy? Of course they said yes. There was an overseer standing there with a whip. Of course they were going to say yes. Yes, they were happy. They weren't going to start saying, no, this is terrible. And so that was, again, a powerful argument, but nobody seemed to work out that they weren't answering freely. It wasn't their real opinion that they were delighted to be slaves. Of course they weren't. Punishments were not really discussed very much by the people who were investigating, you could say. There was some absolutely violent, savage punishments. Sometimes being whipped to death in front of the call all the slaves together, and somebody tried to run away, for example, they would be beaten or whipped until they died, and that would be an example for the others. It would be a demonstration. It wasn't often mentioned that the white plantation owner, well, whether we call it rape, I suppose it would, they actually grew their own slaves by impregnating the women, so that they got some slaves that they didn't have to pay for. You know, there were mixed race children being born, light-skinned children, you know, hundreds of years ago, because the slave owners, the plantation owners, were, well, that seemed like a good idea, really, so that they didn't have to buy them. We will do something next week about not in the fortnight, about the slave markets, where the captured African slaves were made to stand naked and be examined, poked and prodded and looked at in a disgusting way. Now, I mean, not being treated like human beings, being treated like somebody buying a farm animal at a stock market. Somebody, you know, perfect right to look at the horse, look at its teeth, look at every part of it, poke and prod it, make sure it was in good shape before you parted with the money. Humiliation on humiliation. So we'll do that, more of that in detail. The whole idea of the slave trade, as we say, was not seen as dreadful at all. And the fact that things are coming out of the woodwork now is very, very interesting, and that people are so absolutely appalled and horrified, is because all of it was sort of hushed up. Once we had got rid of the slave trade, once we had passed the legislation in 1807 ending the slave trade, only the trade of slavery itself. It was very interesting how we then leapt, as we often do, onto the moral high ground. We then started to say, the British Navy, then started patrolling the high seas, looking for naughty people with slave ships that were trading in slaves. So one minute we were doing it ourselves, making a fortune, and the next minute we had hopped onto the high ground, moral high ground, and we were denouncing other countries that were still trading in slaves, and taking it upon ourselves, or the Royal Navy taking it upon themselves, to intercept these ships, capture them, and release the slaves, either take them back to Africa or also take them back somewhere in Africa, perhaps not where they started off, and releasing them. And that's the bit that people remembered. Oh, but we ended the slave trade before any other country. How wonderful was that? how clever, how wonderful that we were the first to do that. And then we became from being poachers, we became gamekeepers. And we were looking down on other countries for their wickedness in continuing to trade in slaves. And the same thing happened in 1833 when we abolished slavery as a status in our British colonies. And then looked down on other countries where we still had slaves, like Brazil and America, of course. How disgusting was that? It's amazing how we can justify what we've done by saying, oh, well, look how well we behaved after we've abolished slavery and after abolished the slave trade. We're the good guys. We seem to do that a lot, manage to be the good guys. It's interesting. It's sort of inaccurate, really. It's you airbrush the bad bit out, don't think about it at all, don't recognise it, don't own up to it, until somebody forces you to. And that's what's happening at the moment, that people are investigating families and the records in some stately homes, some archive material probably hasn't been looked at for, well, probably hundreds of years, been sitting there, and all sorts of horrible things are coming out of the woodwork. Like, for example, a few weeks ago, the Lascelles family of Harewood or Harwood House, between Leeds and Harrow, which I used to go to regularly. My mum used to take me practically every holiday to Harewood, or Harwood, they say, where the Princess Royal lived. Our Queen's Auntie Mary, the Lascelles family were married into the royal family, and they've discovered a huge connection with the slave trade, and that the beautiful house, Harewood House, was probably built on the profits from the slave trade. Much embarrassment with the royal connection. And this is going to happen more and more. It's become a trending thing that stately homes, or owners of stately homes, are nervously looking in their archives to see where the fortune came from to enable them to build this absolutely splendid house and have this great estate. Where did the money come from? Is it tainted? Because it's seen now as a terrible thing, if that is where the money came from. So we really need to not get hysterical about it. Some people are getting almost hysterical about it. They're so ashamed and upset. And younger people are, again, on the moral high ground, discovering all these secrets, guilty secrets from the past, and say, well, and we all know about the campaign to get rid of statues, starting with Samuel Coulson. Interestingly, a statue, because he was incredibly generous, he was a philanthropist, a benefactor, he did wonderful things for Bristol. And then, shock horror, he got the money from the slave trade, so let's just get rid of his statue. And of course, that's happening with quite a lot of other statues. People digging, finding out, which is great. Historically, that's good. People investigating, doing almost like archaeology, digging about in the archives to see whether there is any connection with the slave trade and slavery itself. And it's very likely that they will find all sorts of connections. It's already happened to Gladstone. Gladstone knew and was very embarrassed about it. He did know that his family had a great deal of their family cash, their family revenue had come from plantation, of owning slaves. So it's a very, very current issue. And I was saying to Martin in the car as we came today, it was one of the one of the subjects, we call it a supplementary subject, when they introduced the national curriculum a lot of years ago, it was recognised that most of the existing history syllabi were totally Anglo-centric or Eurocentric, and that children weren't being taught about any other countries or any other situations, and that this was wrong in the present day and age, that they should be learning about other countries, other cultures. So lo and behold, into an already very crowded syllabus, the powers that be introduced what we call supplementary subjects, these supplementary topics, modules, use the posh word, which were very, very interesting. And we had a choice. We had to teach 3 of these in the school year. So, sorry, over 3 years. One was the French Revolution. So, learned something about France. There were the Plains people of the Americas, which was Red Indians, and you're not supposed to call them Red Indians anymore. First Nation, but that basically was about Red Indians. The Shogun Empire, everybody saying, what on earth is the Shogun Empire? China, I can't remember the title of that one, the Chinese history. The Mughal Empire, etc. Oh, the First World War. First World War. It's interesting, it wasn't in the syllabus before. First World War. So we had a choice. So we chose First World War. I say we, as a history department. First World War, French Revolution, and then the third one we were sort of saying, well, we ought to do one from further afield. And I was head of department by that time, so I had the job of making the third choice. And some of the colleagues wanted to do the Muslim Empire, and I said, well, our Muslim pupils, not that we had many, but we had Muslim pupils, they must know that they have had an empire, that Islam is, that there is a culture, a wonderful culture of arts and crafts and buildings and writings, etc. They have lots to be proud about. What about our black people? The people saying, go back where you came from. Racism wasn't rampant at Arbitrary, at least we didn't think it was. But I had a pastoral role, and some of the black girls and later boys would confide in me and tell me the things that people had said to them. Other people, horrible, cruel things, and very often go back where you came from. I know there's a huge pool of ignorance here that we need to address. And what is going to make the black kids feel proud? All they know is that they're descended from slaves. That is not anything to feel proud about, particularly for the boys. But very often we felt that they were really good pupils. Certainly at junior school, primary school, their parents would say how hardworking they were, and good pupils they were. And then in adolescence, something happened. And it's probably a realization of their heritage. And that people could scorn them and look down on them for that very reason, that they were descended from slaves. I thought they need to be given pride. So I made the decision we were going to do this topic called the Black Peoples of the Americas. I got a copy of the textbook, which the publishers have given us, free copy, and it looked really promising because it was the story of the degradation and the humiliation and the atrocities perpetrated against the black Africans. And it ended with somebody from descended from slaves candidating to be the next president of the United States, Jesse Jackson. I thought, this is a story of success. This is a story of endeavour, and the way the book was written, the textbook was written, was it showed the struggle, the freedom, but it was also very positive, and it identified many, many great black achievers who, again, been airbrushed out of history because they were black. And I thought, this is going to give black lads in particular, and the girls, something to make them hold their heads high and not feel inferior, which they confided in me they did feel. Because they didn't know anything about their background except that they were descended from slaves, and that was a humiliating thing to think about. And it worked. It really did work. So some of the things I'm, like in interviews, they'll say, what are you proudest of in your career? Well, I'm proud of that, actually, because I think it did help. And it shed light on a place where people were just ignorant. And I learned a huge amount from this, a huge amount that I didn't know. So it's, I think we're all on a learning curve, and it is very, very current. There are people digging away in archives as I speak, looking for evidence in a rather negative way. They're looking to find out whether these great families have a murky past. But what the other thing we need to, apart from, we don't need to be sort of devastated with guilt, which is what some people are trying to make us feel incredibly guilty, is understanding that in the 18th century, slavery and the slave trade were acceptable. And that, yes, we're horrified now, and rightly so, but to understand that things were different then. Say, the past is a different country. Try and understand the culture, and find a way of accommodating that and not feeling too ashamed and too guilty, because that's what's happening. People are trying to make it into a guilt trip that we should all be apologising all the time for what happened in the past, when A, we weren't there, and B, things were very different. So next time, we're going to look at the campaign, the continuing campaign to end slavery itself. And that turned out to be a much harder campaign. That took many more years to achieve. So look forward to seeing you all in a fortnight. Thank you for listening.
We stand up a minute.
Stand up.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Judy. See you next
Thank you very
time.
much, Judy.
Thank you.
I will circulate any information I can about the recording, just in case anybody wants to have another look at it. And I'll get that off tomorrow. Otherwise, it'll be in a fortnight's time. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Judy.
Yeah, we can leave. Yes, we leave.